In part 1 of this series, Keeping Families Connected, we addressed the security needs of families. In part 2, Keeping Communities Connected, we showed how working with like-minded others can benefit all with even greater safety during and beyond a global disaster, using affordable consumer and amateur two-way radios. Given that families and communities have had to cope with the difficulties of major disasters throughout human history, you may wonder, is there really a benefit that justifies the cost and trouble of implementing two-way radios for survival? Let's take that question head on and see what we see. Consider this. In the wake of a global disaster, those who survive the initial events will need to begin a painful process of learning what works and learning what hurts. The goal being to learn enough about what works before what hurts kills you. This is how it has worked in the past, and in the future, survivors will face the same challenges, with the exception of one key difference. Those who begin making a preparedness effort today to implement an effective communication strategy will streamline the trial and error process of learning what works and learning what hurts. Consequently, gaining that knowledge will cost these future survivors much less in terms of blood and treasure. Is this consistent with modern consumerism as we know it today? No, because the retail price tag on a two-way radio is actually a distraction from the true cost of survival. This is because the real cost cannot be expressed with a price tag. Rather, it will be carved into the grave markers of those who forfeited their lives to learn what hurts the hard way. For them, there will be no rebates, no returns, and no discounts. Just cold graves and a simple cost equation. The less you prepare, the more graves you can expect to dig. Then there is another matter that some would argue as being equally important. It is the future beyond disaster. This is the issue we'll discuss in this part, creating a post-disaster global Alternet. To do this, let's see what we can do simultaneously to help ourselves as we create hope for the future. This is by no means a nebulous or irrelevant issue, because throughout the collective memories of our species, there has always been a conflict of will. It's always been there. It always will be there, now and into the future. On one side, there will always be stout-hearted men and women who prize freedom above life itself. In opposition to them will always be self-serving tyrants who will be happy to deny them one or both. Ergo, future survivors will not only have to overcome terrible hardships, they'll also have to survive self-serving tyrants as well. To do so, they'll need to organize with like-minded others so they can become a force for good. This is why tyrants keep us isolated with the timeless strategy of divide and conquer. They can never prevent people from becoming aware of the awful things they are doing. However, they can, and do quite successfully, prevent people from organizing around such shared awareness. Ergo, if you can break the ability of people to organize around a common idea, you break the threat. As the old saying goes, old tricks are the best tricks. And this is why tyrants are waging a quiet war against the one technology future survivors will be able to use to give them a way to organize and thereby break free from the chains of tyranny. This technology is analog radio frequency, or simply analog RF. A citizens band CB radio is a perfect example of analog RF, and most amateur radios today are still analog RF. However, that is changing, and this is not a good thing for future survivors. With this in mind, co-author Dwayne W. Brayton and I pray you remember this one thing. Analog RF is the heartbeat of freedom. Accept no substitutes. Again, analog RF is the heartbeat of freedom. Accept no substitutes. Keeping this in mind, let's see how analog RF is now being pushed ever so gently into the dustbin of history. Then we'll show you what tyrants fear most about analog RF. In our book, Radio Free Earth, Community Preparedness and Two-Way Radios, we present a total communication strategy using affordable consumer and amateur two-way radios that are now on the market. Consumer radios such as the inexpensive Bubble Pack walkie-talkies and citizen band radios are analog radios. These are the very kinds of two-way radios future survivors will use in order to connect families and like-minded others on a limited basis. However, for full capability and the ability to give future survivors hope for the future, more robust analog RF amateur ham radios are absolutely necessary. In direct opposition to this need, there are three disturbing trends in amateur radio today that work in favor of the tyrants. The first is digital radios. The second, an aging base of amateur radio operators. And third, the suppression for the role of amateur radio operators in conducting emergency communications, EMCOMs. Let's begin with digital radios, which are now gaining popularity in the amateur radio community. Given that we live in a modern digital age, you may wonder, would it not be more logical to use these newer digital radio technologies as they are gaining in popularity? In terms of survival, the answer is no way, no how. Digital two-way radios are a radical departure from the time-honored tradition of amateur radio dating back well over a century, that being infrastructure independence. In other words, analog RF radios communicate directly to each other without the need for any middleman technologies. Conversely, digital two-way radios do require different types of middlemen services in the form of infrastructure, such as the Internet. Therefore, after a global disaster causes the nation's centralized infrastructure to fail, along with the Internet, the only remaining use for digital two-way radios will be as grave markers. Meanwhile, groups of survivors left to fend for themselves on the surface of the planet will need to find talented folks with the experience and knowledge to make two-way amateur communications possible. Regrettably, this is a huge concern today. Due to the advent of cellular communications, the popularity of amateur radio amongst middle-aged men and women in their 40s and 50s has fallen significantly. The result is that the average age of amateur radio operators, hams in America today, could be as high as 80 years of age. Thankfully, these senior hams tend to be devoted to analog radio. Today, the amateur radio community is still using a well-known term far, far too often. It is silent key, or simply SK, and it means that a licensed ham has passed. At the outset of a global disaster, our nation's populations of hams, which are well advanced in their years, will suffer a catastrophic silent key extinction event. If you love freedom, this must be prevented because our aging hams are living human treasures, and when they become silent keys, their precious knowledge and experience will die with them. An outcome that is certain to be disastrous for future survivors, whether they understand that loss or not. Thankfully, there are ways to deal with this, and we discuss them at length in our book, Radio Free Earth. But obviously, the most important thing will be a resurgence of interest in analog RF, beginning with you, because this is something you can do, which means it is your responsibility as well. Everyone talks the talk about freedom, but if you walk the walk, you know what you need to do. You need to join a ham radio club, get a license, get a radio, and get on the air. And with that, let's move on to the third trend that will help enable tyrants to dominate the lives of future survivors. Founded in 1914, the American Radio Relay League, ARRL, is a non-commercial organization of radio amateurs. This institution has always had a remarkable motto: when all else fails, amateur radio. However, the ARRL has begun backing away from this time-honored tradition, so it can embrace digital two-way radios on a hobbyist level. For example, when co-author Dwayne W. Brayton and I began working on Radio Free Earth in 2016, the motto, when all else fails, amateur radio, was featured proudly on the ARRL homepage. Today, it is no longer there, and you literally need to use a search engine to find it. In a similar vein, there is an emerging level of pushback from ham operators themselves against a return to this time-honored tradition of being in service to others when all else fails. Case in point is ham John W. Long, that's Kilo Alpha 4 Delta Papa Oscar, of Leesburg, Virginia, who on October 16, 2018, wrote on a leading ham website the following: "The notion that amateur radio can save the day in an emergency is just not realistic. What if there was a mega disaster like Yellowstone erupted, or we are under an EMP attack? What will hams do? Who are you going to talk to, and for what? Help from who?" John W. Long. We looked up Mr. Long's call sign and learned that he is retired from the Department of Defense. Now, we found that odd because as such, he would have certainly known about another volunteer ham program called MARS, the Military Auxiliary Radio System. Founded in 1915, MARS is operated by volunteer ham radio operators for the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Army. Given that retired Department of Defense employee John Long views the need of future survivors to communicate as being unrealistic, why is he likewise mocking the Department of Defense for being just as unrealistic? What is Mr. Long's message here? that emergency communications, MCOMs, are only for the government and not for the people? Apparently, Mr. Long is saying that ARRL and Mars are unrealistic and useless, and that our only real choice is to forfeit our lives to tyrants. On the other hand, is analog RF still realistic? And if so, for whom? A critical question when one considers the grassroots movements springing up across America and Europe in an all-out revolt against the globalist agenda. And each attempt to suppress these uprisings only provokes larger protests and further spreads the movement's popularity across national boundaries. In response, tyrants are redoubling their efforts to destroy any notion that analog amateur two-way radios are both realistic and helpful for future survivors. So what happens if the tyrants prevail? They will have effectively killed the future of analog RF as an enabling technology for an enlightened future. Absent that technology, future survivors will be at the mercy of these power-crazed sociopaths. This is exactly what the tyrants want. But what do the stout-hearted lovers of freedom want? To prevail in a way that preserves their personal freedom while giving future generations a true path to hope for the future. This is the outcome we hope for, and in our book Radio Free Earth, Community Preparedness and Two-Way Radios, you'll find a chapter titled Knowledge Exchange. It may inspire you with hope for the future because it describes a time when future survivors can use sophisticated amateur two-way radios to collaborate over vast distances with like-minded others without the need for infrastructure. Hence, they will be able to freely share knowledge for the betterment of all. When that happens, those with stout hearts and the knowing of things will use analog RF to collaborate both near and far. Through their efforts, future survivors will see amazing inventions being shared worldwide to help usher in an age of post-disaster personal freedom and enlightenment. Yes, that does sound good, but nonetheless, you may be wondering, what if the Internet is somehow reconstituted again? Could tyrants use it to suppress future survivors using technologies created by search engine giant Google, for example? The answer is no, for two reasons. First, Google requires infrastructure, which makes it easy for anonymous tyrants to control everyone as they wish, assuming that the Internet can be reconstituted without a power grid. However, as the result of a global disaster, future survivors will have learned a bitter lesson: that centralized infrastructure is easily used to control and enslave people, not to liberate them. Conversely, analog RF is and will always be infrastructure independent, which is why it is the heartbeat of freedom, except no substitutes. The second reason is that analog RF is invasive. This is why tyrants cannot completely stop it. And this is a fabulous thing, as we explain in our book Radio Free Earth, in a chapter titled Hope for the Future. In this chapter, we explain how the Voice of America and other international broadcasters were able to overcome the considerable efforts of the Soviet Union during the Cold War to block Western analog RF broadcasts. After reading that chapter, you'll know why and how future survivors can use this same strategy to create a defining technology for the future. A next-generation Internet I like to call the Alternet. A new technology that will not be created or owned by any tyrants, but rather by those stout-hearted souls who prize human freedom. The Alternet will begin with a collaboration of survivors possessing the necessary engineering experience, and they will use analog RF two-way radios to collaborate near and far. In the process, they will create an Alternet, a next-generation Internet, if you will, that will be impossible for the tyrants to control. The result is that freedom-loving survivors will be able to build an enlightened future for generations to come. A glorious Star Trek future, if you will, and the enabling technology for this enlightened age is within your grasp today. It is analog RF, the heartbeat of freedom, except no substitutes. We hope you've enjoyed this 3-part series and that you will watch our other 2 series. Post-disaster communications offers a high-level view of how future survivors will use analog RF two-way radios to organize with like-minded others for the purpose of security and more. The other is Citizens Band Radios for Survival, and it explains the simplest and least expensive way to launch your own affordable and practical survival communication strategy. Until the next time, remember this: Radio Free Earth will pay for itself many times over with your initial radio purchases, and the sooner you begin, the more you save. To purchase our book, Radio Free Earth, online, visit amazon.radiofreeearth.org. We offer 3 different editions: a low-cost black and white edition and 2 collector-grade all-color special editions. For the Radio Free Earth team, this is Marshall Masters, and if things go sideways, we'll catch you on the 40.